Chapter 6. There was someone crying. There was. The next day, the rain poured down in torrents again, and when Mary looked out of her window, the moor was almost hidden by a gray mist and the clouds. There could be no going out today. "What do you do in your cottage when it rains like this?" she asked Martha. "Try to keep out from under each other's feet mostly," Martha answered. There does seem a lot of us then. Mother's a good fair-tempered woman, but she gets fair moithered. The biggest one goes out to the cowshed and plays there. Dickon, he doesn't mind the wet. He just goes out the same as if the sun was shining. He says he sees things on rainy days as doesn't show when it's a fair weather. He once found a little fox cub half drowned in its hole, and he brought it home in the bosom of his shirt to keep it warm. Its mother had been killed nearby, and the hole was swum out, and the rest of the litter was dead. He's got it at home now. He found a half-drowned young crow another time, and he brought it home and tamed it too. It's named Soot because it's so black, and it hops and flies about with him everywhere." The time had come when Mary had forgotten to resent Martha's familiar talk. She had even begun to find it interesting and to be sorry when she stopped or went away. The stories she had been told by her ayah when she lived in India had been quite unlike those Martha had been able to tell about the moorland cottage which held 14 people who lived in 4 little rooms and never had quite enough to eat. The children seemed to tumble about and amuse themselves like a litter of rough, good-natured collie puppies. Mary was most attracted by the mother and Dickon. When Martha told stories of what Mother did and said, they always sounded comfortable. "If I had a raven or a fox cub I could play with," said Mary, "but I have nothing." Martha looked perplexed. "Can thou knit?" she asked. "No," answered Mary. "Can thou sew?" "No." "Can thou read?" "Yes." "Then why doesn't thou read something or learn a bit of spelling? Thou'st all good enough to be learning by thy book a good bit now." "I haven't any books," said Mary. "Those I had were left behind in India." "That's a pity," said Martha. "If Mrs. Medlock'll let thee go into the library, there's thousands of books there." Mary did not ask where the library was, because she was suddenly inspired by a new idea. She made up her mind to go and find it herself. "Massigno, welcome to the stream. I'm so glad that you're able to stay up late enough for this. Fridays were good for it. Bedtime stories, though, I'm sure will put you to sleep because you got that early sleep time." I get all cozied up here. So Mary made up her mind to go and find it herself. She was not troubled about Mrs. Medlock. Mrs. Medlock seemed always to be in her comfortable housekeeper's sitting room downstairs. In this queer place, one scarcely ever saw anyone at all. In fact, there was no one to see but the servants, and when their master was away, they lived a luxurious life below stairs, where there was a huge kitchen hung about with shining brass and pewter, and a large servants' hall where there were 4 or 5 abundant meals eaten every day, and where a great deal of lively romping went on when Mrs. Medlock was out of the way. Mary's meals were served regularly, and Martha waited on her, but no one troubled themselves about her in the least. Mrs. Medlock came and looked at her every day or two, but no one told her what to do or required anything of her. She supposed that perhaps this was the English way of treating children. In India, she had always been attended by her ayah, who had followed her about and waited on her hand and foot. She had often been tired of her company. Now she was followed by nobody, and was learning to dress herself, because Martha looked as though she thought she was silly and stupid when she wanted to have things put on and handed to her. "Hasn't thou got good sense?" she said once, when Mary had stood waiting for her to put her gloves on for her. "Our Susan Ann's twice as sharp as thee, and she's only 4-year-old. Sometimes thou looks fair soft in the head." Mary had worn her contrary scowl for an hour after that, but it made her think several entirely new things. She stood at the window for about 10 minutes this morning after Martha had swept up the hearth for the last time and gone downstairs. She was thinking over the new idea which had come to her when she had heard of the library. She did not care very much about the library itself, because she read very few books, but to hear of it brought back to mind the 100 rooms with closed doors. She wondered if they were all really locked and what she would find if she could get into any of them. Were there 100 really? Why shouldn't she go and see how many doors she could count? It would be something to do on this morning when she had nothing to do and could not go out. She had never been taught to ask permission to do things, and she knew nothing at all about authority. So she would have not thought it necessary to ask Mrs. Medlock if she might walk about the house, even if she had seen her. She opened the door of the room and went into the corridor, and then she began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors, and it led her up a short flights of steps which mounted to others again. There were doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Sometimes they were pictures of dark, curious landscapes, but oftenest they were portraits of men and women in queer, grand costumes made of satin and velvet. She found herself in one long gallery whose walls were covered with these portraits. She had never thought there could be so many in any house. She walked slowly down this place and stared at the faces, which were also seeming to stare at her. She felt as if they were wondering what a little girl from India was doing in their house. Some were pictures of children, their little girls in thick satin frocks, which reached to their feet and stood out about them. Boys with puffed sleeves and lace collars and long hair, or with big ruffs around their necks. She always stopped to look at the children and wonder what their names were, and where they had gone, and why they wore such odd clothes. There was a stiff, plain little girl, rather like herself. She wore a green brocade dress and held a green parrot on her finger. Her eyes had a sharp, curious look. "Where do you live now?" said Mary aloud to her. "I wish you were here." Surely no other little girl ever spent such a queer morning. It seemed as if there was no one at all in the huge, rambling house but her own small self, wandering about upstairs and down, through narrow passages and wide ones, where it seemed to her that no one but herself ever walked. Since so many rooms had been built, people must have lived in them, but it all seemed so empty that she could not quite believe it true. I think I might need to poke the fire up a little bit. All right, fire. It's definitely getting a good coal going. Maybe I could put another log on it. Why the heck not, right? Okay. Mary was wandering around the corridors. It was not until she climbed to the second floor that she thought of turning the handle of a door. All the doors were shut, as Mrs. Medlock had said, but at last she put her hand on the handle of one of them and turned it. She was almost frightened for a moment when she felt that it turned without difficulty, and that when she pushed upon the door itself, it slowly and heavily opened. It was a massive door and opened into a big bedroom. There were embroidered hangings on the wall, and inlaid furniture such as she had seen in India stood about the room. A broad window with leaded panes looked out upon the moor, and over the mantel was another portrait of the stiff, plain little girl who seemed to stare at her more curiously than ever. "Perhaps she slept here once," said Mary. "She stares at me so that she makes me feel queer." After that, she opened more doors and more. She saw so many rooms that she became quite tired and began to think that there must be 100, though she had not counted them. In all of them, there were old pictures or old tapestries with strange scenes worked on them. There were curious pieces of furniture and curious ornaments in nearly all of them. In one room, which looked like a lady's sitting room, the hangings were all embroidered velvet, and in a cabinet were about 100 little elephants made of ivory. They were of different sizes, and some had their mahots or palanquins on their back. Some were much bigger than the others, and some were so tiny that they seemed only babies. Mary had seen carved ivory in India, and she knew all about elephants. She opened the door of the cabinet and stood on the footstool and played with these for quite a long time. When she got tired, she set the elephants in order and shut the door of the cabinet. In all her wanderings through the long corridors and empty rooms, she had seen nothing alive, but in this room she saw something. Just after she had closed the cabinet door with a tiny rustling sound, it made her jump and look around the sofa by the fireplace, from which it seemed to come. In the corner of the sofa there was a cushion, and in the velvet which covered it there was a hole, and out of the hole peeped a tiny head with a pair of frightened eyes in it. Mary crept softly across the room to look. The bright eyes belonged to a little gray mouse, and the mouse had eaten a hole in the cushion and made a comfortable nest there. 6 baby mice were curled up asleep next to her. If there was no one else alive in the 100 rooms, there were 7 mice who did not look lonely at all. "If they wouldn't be so frightened, I would take them back with me," said Mary. She had wandered about long enough to feel tired, and too tired to wander any farther, and so she turned back. 2 or 3 times she lost her way by turning down the wrong corridor, and was obliged to ramble up and down until at last she found the right one. And then finally she reached her own floor again, though she was some distance from her own room and did not know exactly where she was. "I believe I have taken a wrong turning again," she said, standing still at what seemed to be the end of a passage with tapestry on the wall. "I don't know which way to go. How still everything is." Oh, Boo Boo is climbing on me. There you go, buddy. It was while she was standing here, and just after she had said this, that the stillness was broken by a sound. It was another cry, but not quite like the one she had heard last night. It was only a short one, a fretful, childish whine muffled by passing through walls. "It's nearer than it was," said Mary, her heart beating rather faster, "and it is crying." She put her hand accidentally upon the tapestry near her, and then sprang back, feeling quite startled. The tapestry was the covering of a door which fell open and showed her that there was another part of the corridor behind it, and Mrs. Medlock was coming up it with her bunch of keys in her hand and a very cross look on her face. "What are you doing?" she said, and she took Mary by the arm and pulled her away. "What did I tell you?" "I turned around the wrong corner," explained Mary. "I didn't know which way to go, and I heard someone crying." She quite hated Mrs. Medlock at the moment, but she hated her more the next. "You didn't hear anything of the sort," said the housekeeper. "You come along back to your own nursery, or I'll box your ears." And she took her by the arm and half pushed, half pulled her up on one passage and down another, until she pushed her in at the door of her own room. "Now," she said, "you'll stay where you're told, or you'll find yourself locked up. The master had better get you a governess, same as he said he would. You're the one that needs someone to look sharp after you. I've got enough to do." She went out of the room and slammed the door behind her, and Mary went and sat on the hearthrug, pale with rage. She did not cry, but ground her teeth. "There was someone crying. There was, she said to herself. She had heard it twice now, and sometime she would find out. She had found out a great deal this morning. She felt as if she had been on a long journey, and at any rate she had something to amuse her all the time, and she had played with the ivory elephants and seen the gray mouse and its babies in their nest in the velvet cushion. Chapter 7. The Key to the Garden. 2 days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha. "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" The rainstorm had ended, and the gray mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant, deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of sky so blue. In India, skies were hot and blazing, but this one was of a cool, deep blue, which almost seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely bottomless lake. And here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful dreary gray. "Aye," said Martha, with a cheerful grin, "the storm's over for a bit. It does like this at this time of year. It goes off in the night like it was pretending it had never been here and never meant to come again. That's because the springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming. I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England, Mary said. No, said Martha, sitting up on her heels among her black lead brushes. Now to the sort. What does that mean? Asked Mary seriously. In India, the natives spoke different dialects, which only a few people understood, so she was not surprised when Martha used words she did not know. Martha laughed as she had done the first morning. There now, she said. I've talked broad Yorkshire again, like Mrs. Medlock said I mustn't. Now to the sort means nothing of the sort, slowly and carefully. But it takes so long to say it. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it is sunny. I told thee that I'd like it the more just after a bit. Just you wait until you see the gold-colored gorse blossoms, the blossoms of the broom, the heather flowering, all purple bells, and hundreds of butterflies fluttering, and bees humming, and skylarks soaring up in the air and singing. You'll want to get out on it at sunrise and live out on it all day like Dickon does. Could I ever get there? Asked Mary wistfully, looking through her window at the far-off blue. It was so new and big and wonderful, and such a heavenly color. I don't know, answered Martha. Thou's never used thy legs since thou was born, it seems to me. Thou couldn't walk 5 mile. It's 5 mile to our cottage. I should like to see your cottage. Martha stared at her a moment curiously before she took up her polishing brush and began to rub the grate again. She was thinking that the small, plain face did not look quite as sour at this moment as it had done the first morning she saw it. It looked just a trifle like little Susan Ann's when she wanted something very much. I'll ask my mother about it, she said. She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. It's my day out today and I'm going home. I am glad. Mrs. Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps she could talk to her. I like your mother, said Mary. I should think thou did, agreed Martha, polishing away. I've never seen her, said Mary. No, thou hasn't, replied Martha. She sat up on her heels again and rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand as if puzzled for a moment, but she ended quite positively. Well, she's that sensible and hard-working and good-natured and clean that no one can help liking her whether they'd seen her or not. When I'm going home to her on my day out, I just jump for joy when I'm crossing the moor. I like Dickon, added Mary, and I've never seen him. Well, said Martha stoutly, I've told thee that the birds likes him, and the rabbits, and the wild sheep, and ponies, and the foxes themselves. I wonder, staring at her reflexively, what Dickon would think of thee. He wouldn't like me, said Mary in her stiff, cold little way. No one does. Martha looked reflective again. How dost thou like thyself? She inquired, really curious if she were wanting to know. Mary hesitated a moment and thought it over. Not at all, really, she answered, but I've never thought of that before. Martha grinned a little as if some homely recollection. Mother said that to me once, she said. She was at her washtub and I was in a bad temper ill talking to folk, and she turns round on me and says, Thou young vixen, thou. There thou stands saying thou doesn't like this one and doesn't like that one. How does thou like thyself? And it made me laugh, and it brought me to my senses in a minute. She went away in high spirits as soon as she had given Mary her breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles across the moor to her cottage, and she was going to help her mother with the washing and do the week's baking and enjoy herself thoroughly. Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew she was no longer in the house. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run round and round the flower garden 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished, she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of the little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the first kitchen garden and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seemed to have done him good. He spoke to her of his own accord. Springtime's coming, he said. Canna thou smell it? Mary sniffed and thought she could. I smell something nice and fresh and damp. That's the good rich earth, he answered, digging away. It's in a good humor making ready to grow things. It's glad when planting time comes. It's dull in the winter when it's got naught to do. In the flower gardens out there, things will be stirring down below in the dark. The sun's warming 'em. You'll see bits of green spikes sticking out of the black earth after a bit." "What will they be?" asked Mary. "Crocuses and snowdrops and daffodillies. Hast thou never seen 'em?" "No. Everything is hot and wet and green after the rains in India, and I think things grow up in the night." "Well, these won't grow up in a night," said Weatherstaff. "Thou'll have to wait for 'em. They'll poke up a bit higher here and push out a spike more there and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em." "I am going to," answered Mary. Very soon she heard the soft rustling flight of wings again, and she knew at once that the robin had come again. He was also very pert and lively, and hopped about so close to her feet, put his head on one side, and looked at her so slyly that she asked Ben Weatherstaff a question. "Do you think he remembers me?" she said. "Remembers thee?" said Weatherstaff indignantly. "He knows every cabbage stump in the gardens, let alone the people. He's never seen a little wench here before, and he's bent on finding all about thee. Thou's no need to try to hide anything from him." "Are things stirring down below in the dark in the garden where he lives?" Mary inquired. "What garden?" grunted Weatherstaff, becoming surly again. "The one where the old rose trees are," she could not help asking because she wanted to know so much. "Are all the flowers dead, or do some of them come again in the summer? Are there ever any roses?" "Ask him," said Ben Weatherstaff, hunching his shoulders toward the robin. "He's the only one as knows. No one else has seen inside it for 10 year." 10 years was a long time, Mary thought. She had been born 10 years ago. She walked away, slowly thinking. She had begun to like the garden just as she had begun to like the robin and Dickon and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha, too. That seemed a good many people to like when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long ivy-covered wall over which she could see the treetops, and the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her, and it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there he was, hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he had not followed her. But she knew he had followed her, and the surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried out. "You do! You are prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out, and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he was showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Mistress Mary forgot that she had ever been contrary in her life when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him and bend down and talk and try to make something like robin sounds. Oh, to think that he should actually let her come as near to him as that. He knew nothing in the world would make her put out her hand toward him or startle him in the least tiniest way. He knew it because he was a real person, only nicer than any other person in the world. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. That's better. The flower bed was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest, but there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed, and as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. "Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it is the key to the garden." I'm going to take myself a little break. I'll probably puff up the fire a little bit. I'll be back. Got a good cliffhanger with that key.
That's very good.
All right. I've got my water. I'll stir up the fire a little bit, and then we'll get back into it. That is a honkin' log. Let's try one that's not quite so honkin'. Okay. Chapter 8. The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden, and if she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms and having nothing whatsoever to do to amuse herself had set her inactive brain to working and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it. Just as it had given her an appetite and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. In India, she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything. But in this place, she was beginning to care and want to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come here, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on the wall. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever should find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with red cheeks, redder than ever, and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. It was pretty on the moor with the birds getting all up and the rabbits scampering and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had gotten the baking and washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. "I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage all smelt nice, clean hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickens said our cottage was good enough even for a king." In the evening they had all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes, mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India and who had been waited on all her life by what Martha called blacks until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about the blacks and the ship that you came in. I couldn't tell them enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers." "My word!" cried delighted Martha. "It would set 'em clean off their heads. Would thou really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show like we heard they had in York once." "India is quite different from Yorkshire," Mary said slowly, as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me?" "Why, our Dickon's eyes got nearly started out of his head, they got that round," answered Martha. "But mother, she was put out about your seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, 'Hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse?' And I said, 'No, he hasn't, though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it, but she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. "I don't want a governess," said Mary sharply. but Mother says you ought to be learning your books by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you. And she says, now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel all yourself. Big place like that, wandering all about alone, and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up, she says, and I said I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. You do cheer me up, she said. I like to hear you talk. Presently, Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. What does thou think, she said with a grin. I brought thee a present. A present? Exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? A man was driving across the moor peddling, Martha explained, and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our little Lisbeth Ellen called out, Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles. And Mother, she calls out quite sudden, Here, stop, mister, how much are they? And he says, 2pence. And Mother, she began fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, Martha, thou brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence of it and buy that child a skipping rope, and she bought one, and here it is. She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end, but Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. What is it for? She asked curiously. For? Cried out Martha. Does that mean they've not got skipping ropes in India for all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? No wonder most of 'em's black. This is just what it's for. Just watch me. And she ran into the middle of the room and, taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her. And the queer faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to do under their very noses. But Martha did not even see them. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping and counted as she skipped until she had reached 100. I could skip longer than that, she said when she stopped. I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fat then as I am now, and I was in practice. Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel excited herself. It looks nice, she said. Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that? You just try it, urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what Mother says. She says nothing'll do her more good than a skipping rope. It's the sensiblest toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air skipping, and it'll stretch her arms and legs and give her some strength in 'em. It was plain that there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop. Put on the things and run and skip out of doors, said Martha. Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so as thou wrap up warm. Mary put on her coat and hat and took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something and turned back rather slowly. Martha, she said, they were your wages. It was your 2pence, really. Thank you. She said it stiffly because she was not used to thanking people or noticing that they did things for her. Thank you, she said, and held out her hand because she did not know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little handshake, as if she was not accustomed to this sort of thing either. Then she laughed. Thou'rt a queer old womanish thing, she said. If thou'd been our Elizabeth Ellen, thou'd have given me a kiss. Mary looked stiffer than ever. Do you want me to kiss you? Martha laughed again. Nay, not me, she answered. If thou was different, perhaps thou'd want to thyself, but thou isn't. Run off outside and play with thy rope. Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first, she had disliked her very much, but now she did not. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and skipped and counted until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining and a little wind was blowing, not a rough wind, but one which came in delightful little gusts and brought a fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped round the fountain garden and up one walk and down another. She skipped at last into the kitchen garden and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to his robin, which was hopping about him. She skipped down the walk toward him, and he lifted his head and looked at her with a curious expression. She had wondered if he would notice her. She wanted him to see her skip. "Well," he exclaimed, "upon my word, p'raps thou'rt a young'un after all, and p'raps thou's got child's blood in thy veins instead of sour buttermilk. Thou's skipped red into thy cheeks as sure as my name's Ben Weatherstaff. I wouldn't have believed thou could do it." "I never skipped before," Mary said. "I'm just beginning. I can only go up to 20. "Thou keep on," said Ben. "Thou shapes well enough at it for a young'un that lives with heathen. Just see how he's watching thee," jerking his head toward the robin. "He followed after thee yesterday. He'll be at it again today. He'll be bound to find out what the skipping rope is. He's never seen one. Shaking his head at the bird. "Thy curiosity will be the death of thee sometime if thou doesn't look sharp." Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. At length she went up to her own special walk and made up her mind to try if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly, but before she had gone halfway down the path, she was hot and breathless that she was obliged to stop. She did not mind much, because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin, swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped toward him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin, she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy onto the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a loud, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they are nearly always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in her Aya's stories, and she always said that was what happened almost at the moment, was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still, she jumped toward it and caught it in her hand. This she did because she had seen something under it. A round knob, which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was a loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over the wood and iron. Mary's heart began to jump, and her hands began to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting his head on one side, as if he were as excited as she was. What was this under her hands, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found it fitted the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn, and then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it. And she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it and shut it behind her and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. Think I might stir the fire up a little bit. Maybe we can get another log in there. that baby's a-blazing. That's gonna be a nice biggin. Yeah, we approve of big blazing fires. Are y'all as happy as I am that she found the garden and the key and the door? Chapter 9. The strangest house anyone ever lived in. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could imagine. The high walls which shut it in were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, which were so thick that they were matted together. Mary Lennox knew they were roses because she had seen a great many roses in India. All the ground was covered with grass of a wintry brown, and out of it grew clumps and bushes, which were surely rose bushes if they were alive. There were numbers of standard roses which had so spread their branches that they were like little trees. There were other trees in the garden, and one of the things which made the place look strangest and loveliest was that climbing roses had run all over them and swung down long tendrils which made light swaying curtains, and here and there they had caught at each other or at a far-reaching branch and crept from one tree to another and made lovely bridges of themselves. There were neither leaves nor roses on them now, and Mary did not know whether they were dead or alive. But their thin gray or brown branches and sprays looked like a sort of hazy mantle spreading over everything, walls and trees, even brown grass, where they had fallen from their fastenings and run along the ground. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree which made it all look so mysterious. Mary had thought it must be different from other gardens which had not been left all by themselves so long, and indeed it was different from any place she had ever seen in her life. "How still it is," she whispered. "How still." Then she waited a moment and listened at the stillness. The robin, who had flown to his treetop, was still as all the rest. He did not even flutter his wings. He sat without stirring and looked at Mary. "No wonder it is still," she whispered again. "I am the first person who has spoken in here for 10 years. She moved away from the door, stepping as softly as if she were afraid of awakening someone. She was glad that there was grass under her feet and that her steps made no sounds. She walked under one of the fairy-like gray arches between the trees and looked up at the sprays and tendrils which formed them. "I wonder if they are all quite dead," she said. "Is it all quite a dead garden? I wish it wasn't." If she had been Ben Weatherstaff, she could have told whether the wood was alive by looking at it, but she could only see that there were gray or brown sprays and branches, and none showed any signs of even a tiny leaf bud anywhere. But she was inside the wonderful garden, and she could come through the door under the ivy any time, and she felt as if she had found a world all her own. The sun was shining inside the 4 walls, and the high arch of blue sky over this particular piece of Misselthwaite seemed even more brilliant and soft than it was over the moor. The robin flew down from his treetop and hopped about, or flew after her from one bush to another. He chirped a great deal and had a very busy air, as if he were showing her things. Everything was strange and silent, and she seemed to be 100 miles away from anyone. But somehow she did not feel lonely at all. All that troubled her was her wish that she knew whether all the roses were dead, or if perhaps some of them had lived and might put out leaves and buds as the weather got warmer. She did not want it to be a quite dead garden. If it were a quite alive garden, how wonderful it would be, and what thousands of roses would grow on every side. Her skipping rope had hung over her arm when she came in, and after that she had walked about for a while. She thought she would skip around the whole garden, stopping when she wanted to look at things. There seemed to have been grass paths here and there, and in 1 or 2 corners there were alcoves of evergreen with stone seats or tall moss-covered flower urns in them. As she came near the second of these alcoves, she stopped skipping. There had once been a flower bed in it, and she thought she saw something sticking out of the pale black earth, some sharp little green points. She remembered what Ben Weatherstaff had said, and she knelt down to look at them. "Yes, they are tiny growing things, and they might be crocuses or snowdrops or daffodils," she whispered. She bent very close to them and sniffed the fresh scent of the damp earth. She liked it very much. "Perhaps there are some other ones coming up in other places," she said. "I will go all over the garden and look." She did not skip, but walked. She went slowly and kept her eyes on the ground. She looked in the old border beds and among the grass, and after she had gone round trying to miss nothing, she had found ever so many more sharp pale green points, and she had become quite excited again. "It isn't quite a dead garden," she said softly to herself, "even if the roses are dead and there are other things alive." She did not know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some of the places where the green points were pushing their way through that she thought they did not seem to have enough room to grow. She searched about until she found a rather sharp piece of wood and knelt down and dug and weeded out the weeds and grass until she made nice little clear places around them. "Now they look as if they could breathe," she said, after she had finished with the first ones. "I am going to do ever so many more. I'll do all I can see. If I haven't time today, I can come tomorrow." She went from place to place and dug and weeded and enjoyed herself so immensely that she was led on from bed to bed and into the grass under the trees. The exercise made her warm so that she first threw her coat off and then her hat, and without knowing it, she was smiling down onto the grass and the pale green points all the time. The robin was tremendously busy. He was very much pleased to see gardening begun on his own estate. He had often wondered at Ben Weatherstaff, where gardening is done, all sorts of delightful things to eat are turned up in the soil. Now here was this new kind of creature who was not half Ben's size, and yet had had the sense to come into his garden and begin at once. Mistress Mary worked in her garden until it was time to go to her midday dinner. In fact, she was rather late in remembering, and when she put on her coat and hat and picked up the skipping rope, she could not believe that she had been working 2 or 3 hours. She had been actually happy all the time, and dozens of the tiny pale green points were to be seen in cleared places, looking twice as cheerful as they had looked before when the grass and weeds had been smothering them. "I shall come back this afternoon," she said, looking all round at her new kingdom, and speaking to the trees and the rose bushes as if they heard her. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes and ate such a dinner that Martha was delighted. "2 pieces of meat and 2 helps of rice pudding," she said. Mother will be pleased when I tell her what the skipping rope's done for thee." In the course of her digging with her pointed stick, Mistress Mary had found herself digging up a sort of white root rather like an onion. She had put it back in its place and patted the earth carefully down on it, and just now she wondered if Martha could tell her what it was. "Martha," she said, "what are those white roots that look like onions?" "They're bulbs," answered Martha. "Lots of spring flowers grow from 'em. The very little ones are snowdrops and crocuses, and the big ones are narcissuses and jonquils and daffodillies. The biggest of all is lilies and purple flags. They are nice. Dickon's got a whole lot of 'em planted in our own garden." "Does Dickon know all about them?" asked Mary, a new idea taking possession of her. "Our Dickon can make a flower grow out of a brick walk. Mother says he just whispers things out of the ground." "Do bulbs live a long time? Would they live years and years if no one helped them?" inquired Mary anxiously. "They're things as helps themselves," said Martha. "That's why poor folk can afford to have 'em. If you don't trouble 'em, most of 'em will work away underground for a lifetime and spread out and have little uns. There's a place in the park woods here where there's snowdrops by the thousands. They're the prettiest sight in Yorkshire when the spring comes. No one knows when they was planted." "I wish the spring was here now," said Mary. "I want to see all the things that grow in England." She had finished her dinner and gone to her favorite seat on the hearthrug. I wish I had a little spade," she said. "Whatever does thou want a spade for?" asked Martha, laughing. "Art thou going to take to digging? I must tell Mother that, too." Mary looked at the fire and pondered a little. She must be careful if she meant to keep her secret kingdom. She wasn't doing any harm, but if Mr. Craven found out about the open door, he would be fearfully angry and get a new key and lock it up forevermore. She really could not bear that. "This is such a big, lonely place," she said slowly, as if she were turning matters over in her mind. "The house is lonely, the park is lonely, and the gardens are lonely. So many places seem shut up. I never did many things in India, but there were more people to look at, natives and soldiers marching by, and sometimes bands playing, and my ayah told me stories. There's no one here to talk to except you and Ben Weatherstaff, and you have to do your work, and Ben Weatherstaff won't speak to me often. I thought if I had a little spade, I could dig somewhere as he does, and I might make a little garden if he would give me some seeds. Martha's face quite lighted up. "There now," she exclaimed. "If that wasn't one of the things Mother said. She says there's such a lot of room in that big place. Why don't they give her a bit for herself? Even if she does plant nothing but parsley and radishes, she'd dig and rake away and be downright happy over it." Them was the very words she said. "Were they?" said Mary. "How many things she knows, doesn't she?" Said Martha. "It's like she says, a woman brings up 12 children, learns something besides their ABC. Children's as good as arithmetic to set you finding out things." "How much would a spade cost? A little one?" Mary asked. "Well," was Martha's reflective answer, "at Thwaite Village there's a shop or so, and I saw little garden sets with a spade and a rake and a fork all tied together for 2 shillings, and they was stout enough to work with, too." "I've got more than that in my purse," said Mary. "Mrs. Morrison gave me 5 shillings, and Mrs. Medlock gave me some money from Mr. Craven." "Did he remember thee that much?" exclaimed Martha. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to have a shilling a week to spend. She gives me one every Saturday. I didn't know what I could spend it on." "My word, that's riches," said Martha. "Thou can buy anything in the world thou wants. The rent of our cottage is only 1 and 3 pence, and it's like pulling eye teeth to get it. Now I've just thought of something," she said, putting her hands on her hips. "What?" said Mary eagerly. "In the shop at Thwaite they sell packages of flower seeds for a penny each, and our Dickon knows which is the prettiest ones and how to make 'em grow. He walks over to Thwaite many a day for just the fun of it. Dost thou know how to print letters?" suddenly. "I know how to write," Mary answered. Martha shook her head. "Our Dickon can only read printin'. If thou could print, we could write a letter to him and ask him to go buy the garden tools and the seeds at the same time." "Oh, you're a good girl," Mary cried. "You are, really. I didn't know you were so nice. I know I can print letters if I try. Let's ask Mrs. Medlock for a pen and ink and some paper." "I've got some of my own," said Martha. "I bought 'em so I could print a bit of a letter to Mother of a Sunday. I'll go and get it." She ran out of the room, and Mary stood by the fire and twisted her thin little hands together with sheer pleasure. "If I can have a spade," she whispered, "I can make the earth nice and soft and dig up weeds. If I have seeds and can make flowers grow, the garden won't be dead at all. It will come alive." She did not go out again that afternoon, because when Martha returned with her pen and ink and paper, she was obliged to clear the table and carry the plates and dishes downstairs, and when she got into the kitchen, Mrs. Medlock was there and told her to do something. So Mary waited for what seemed to her a long time before she came back. Then it was a serious piece of work to write to Dickon. Mary had been taught very little because her governesses had disliked her too much to stay with her. She could not spell particularly well, but she found that she could print letters when she tried. This was the letter Martha dictated to her. "My dear Dickon, this comes hoping to find you well, as it leaves me at present. Miss Mary has plenty of money, and will you go to Thwaite and buy her some flower seeds and a set of garden tools to make a flower bed? Pick the prettiest ones and easy to grow because she has never done it before and lived in India, which is different. Give my love to Mother and every one of you. Miss Mary is going to tell me a lot more so that on my next day out you can hear about elephants and camels and gentlemen going hunting lions and tigers. Your loving sister, Martha Phoebe Sowerby." "We'll put the money in the envelope and I'll get the butcher boy to take it in his cart. He's a great friend of Dickon's," said Martha. "How shall I get the things when Dickon buys them?" "He'll bring them over to you himself. He'd like to walk this way." "Oh," exclaimed Mary. "Then I shall see him? I never thought I should see Dickon." "Does thou want to see him?" asked Martha suddenly, for Mary had looked so pleased. "Yes, I do. I never saw a boy foxes and crows loved. I want to see him very much." Martha gave a little start, as if she remembered something. "Now to think of me forgetting that there, and I thought I was going to tell you first thing this morning. I asked Mother, and she said she'd ask Mrs. Medlock her own self." "Do you mean," Mary began. "What I said Tuesday, Ask her if you might be driven over to our cottage some day and have a bit of Mother's hot oat cake and butter and a glass of milk. It seemed as if all the interesting things were happening in one day. To think of going over the moor in the daylight when the sky was blue. To think of going into the cottage which held 12 children. Does she think Mrs. Medlock would let me go? She asked quite anxiously. Aye, she thinks she would. She knows what a tidy woman Mother is and how clean she keeps her cottage. If I went, I should see your mother as well as Dickon, said Mary, thinking it over and liking the idea very much. She doesn't seem to be like the mothers in India. Her work in the garden and the excitement of the afternoon ended by making her feel quiet and thoughtful. Martha stayed with her until tea time, but they sat in comfortable quiet and talked very little. Just before Martha went downstairs for the tea tray, Mary asked a question. Martha, has the scullery maid had a toothache again today? Martha certainly started slightly. What makes thee ask that? She said. Because when I waited for so long for you to come back, I opened the door and walked down the corridor to see if you were coming, and I heard that far-off crying again, just as we heard it the other night. There isn't a wind today, so you see it couldn't have been the wind. Said Martha restlessly. Thou mustn't go walking about in corridors and listening. Mr. Craven would be there angry, and there's no knowing what he'd do. I wasn't listening, said Mary. I was just waiting for you, and I heard it. That's 3 times. My word, there's Mrs. Medlock's bell, said Martha, and she ran out of the room. It's the strangest house anyone ever lived in, said Mary drowsily as she dropped her head on the cushioned seat of the armchair near her. Fresh air and digging and skipping rope had made her feel so comfortably tired that she fell asleep. Would you believe we're almost halfway through this book? That's not too bad. I'm going to see if I can stir up that log a little more, get it roaring. Insulation. There we go. All right. I'm going to grab a quick smoke break and I will be back. Enjoy the crackling while I'm gone. Those logs are awfully crackly, though. Sizzling. Yep, that's the imperfect firewood. All right, Chapter 10. Dickon. The sun shone down for nearly a week on the secret garden. The secret garden was what Mary called it when she was thinking of it. She liked the name, and she liked still more the feeling that when its beautiful old walls shut her in, no one knew where she was. It seemed almost like being shut out of the world in some fairy place. The few books she had read and liked had been fairy story books, and she had read of secret gardens in some of the stories. Sometimes people went to sleep in them for 100 years, which she had thought must be rather stupid. She had no intention of going to sleep, and in fact, she was becoming wider awake every day which passed at Misselthwaite. She was beginning to like to be out of doors. She no longer hated the wind, but enjoyed it. She could run faster and longer, and she could skip up to 100. The bulbs in the secret garden must have been much astonished. Such nice clear places were made round them that they had all the breathing space they wanted. And really, if Mistress Mary had known it, they began to cheer up under the dark earth and work tremendously. The sun could get at them and warm them, and when the rain came down, it could reach them at once, so they began to feel very much alive. Mary was an odd, determined little person, and now she had something interesting to be determined about. She was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. She found many more of the sprouting, pale green points than she had ever hoped to find. They seemed to be starting up everywhere, and each day she was sure she had found tiny new ones, some so tiny that they barely peeped above the earth. There were so many that she remembered what Martha had said about the snowdrops by the thousands, and about bulbs spreading and making new ones. These had been left to themselves for 10 years, and perhaps they had spread, like the snowdrops, into the thousands. She wondered how long it would be before they showed that they were flowers. Sometimes she stopped digging to look at the garden and try to imagine what it would be like when it was covered with thousands of lovely things in bloom. During that week of sunshine, she became more intimate with Ben Weatherstaff. She surprised him several times by seeming to start up beside him, as if she sprang out of the earth. The truth was that she was afraid that he would pick up his tools and go away if he saw her coming, so she always walked toward him silently as possible. But in fact, he did not object to her as strongly as he had at first. Perhaps he was secretly rather flattered by her evident desire for his elderly company. Then, also, she was more civil than she had been. He did not know that when she first saw him, she spoke to him as she would have spoken to a native servant, and had not known that a cross, surly, sturdy old Yorkshireman was not accustomed to salaam to his masters and be merely commanded by them to do things. "Thou'rt like the robin," he said to her one morning when he lifted his head and saw her standing by him. "I never knows when I shall see thee or which side thou'll come from." "He's friends with me now," said Mary. "That's like him," snapped Ben Weatherstaff. "Making up to the women folk just for vanity and flightiness. There's nothing he wouldn't do for the sake of showing off and flirting his tail feathers. He's as full of pride as an egg's full of meat." He very seldom talked much, and sometimes did not even answer Mary's questions except by a grunt, but this morning he said more than usual. He stood up and rested one hobnailed boot on the top of his spade while he looked her over. "How long has thou been here?" he jerked out. "I think it's about a month," she answered. "Thou's beginning to do Misselthwaite credit," he said. "Thou's a bit fatter than thou was, and thou's not quite so yeller. Thou looked like a young plucked crow when thou first came into the garden. Thinks to myself, I never set eyes on an uglier, sour-faced young'un." Mary was not vain, and as she had never thought much of her looks, she was not greatly disturbed. I know I'm fatter, she said. My stockings are getting tighter. They used to make wrinkles. There's the robin, Ben Weatherstaff. There indeed was the robin, and she thought he looked nicer than ever. His red waistcoat was as glossy as satin, and he flirted his wings and tail and tilted his head and hopped about with all sorts of lively graces. He seemed determined to make Ben Weatherstaff admire him. But Ben was sarcastic. "Aye, there thou art," he said. "Thou can put up with me for a bit sometimes when thou's got no one better. Thou's been redding up thy waistcoat and polishing thy feathers this 2 weeks. I know what thou's up to. Thou's courting some bold young madam somewhere, telling thy lies to her about being the finest cock robin on Misselmore and ready to fight all the rest of 'em." "Oh, look at him!" exclaimed Mary. The robin was evidently in a fascinating, bold mood. He hopped closer and closer and looked at Ben Weatherstaff more and more engagingly. He flew on to the nearest currant bush and tilted his head and sang a little song right at him. "Thou thinks thou'll get over me by doing that," said Ben, wrinkling his face up in such a way that Mary felt sure he was trying not to look pleased. "Thou thinks no one can stand out against thee, that's what thou thinks." The robin spread his wings. Mary could scarcely believe her eyes. He flew right up to the handle of Ben Weatherstaff's spade and alighted on the top of it. Then the old man's face wrinkled itself slowly into a new expression. He stood still as if he were afraid to breathe, as if he would not have stirred for the world lest his robin should start away. He spoke quite in a whisper. "Well, I'm danged," he said as softly as if he were saying something quite different. "Thou does know how to get at a chap, thou does. Thou's fair unearthly, thou's so knowin'." And he stood without stirring, almost without drawing his breath, until the robin gave another flirt to his wings and flew away. Then he stood looking at the handle of the spade as if there might be magic in it, and then he began to dig again and said nothing for several minutes. But because he kept breaking into a slow grin now and then, Mary was not afraid to talk to him. "Have you a garden of your own?" she asked. "No, I'm bachelor and lodge with Martin at the gate." "If you had one," said Mary, "what would you plant?" "Cabbages and taters and onions." "But if you wanted a flower garden," persisted Mary, "what would you plant?" "Bulbs and sweet-smelling things, but mostly roses." Mary's face lighted up. "Do you like roses?" she said. Ben Weatherstaff rooted up a weed and threw it aside before he answered. "Well, yes, I do. I was learned that by a young lady I was gardener to. She had a lot in the place she was fond of, and she loved 'em like they was children, or robins. I seen her bend over and kiss 'em." He dragged out another weed and scowled at it. "That were as much as 10 year ago." "Where is she now?" asked Mary, much interested. "Heaven," he answered, and drove his spade deep into the soil, according to what the parson says. "What happened to the roses?" Mary asked again, more interested than ever. "They was left to themselves." Mary was becoming quite excited. "Did they die? Do roses quite die when they're left to themselves?" she ventured. "Well, I'd got to like 'em, and I liked her, and she liked 'em," Ben Weatherstaff admitted reluctantly. "Once or twice a year I'd go in and work at 'em a bit, prune 'em and dig about the roots. They run wild, but they was in rich soil, so some of 'em lived." "When they have no leaves and look gray and brown and dry, how can you tell whether they're dead or alive?" inquired Mary. "Wait till the spring gets at 'em. Wait till the sun shines on the rain and the rain falls on the sunshine, and then thou'll find out." "How? How?" cried Mary, forgetting to be careful. "Look along the twigs and branches, and if thou see a bit of brown lumps swelling here and there, watch it after the warm rain and see what happens." He stopped suddenly and looked curiously at her eager face. "Why does thou care so much about roses and such all of a sudden?" he demanded. Mistress Mary felt her face grow red. She was almost afraid to answer. I want to play that I have a garden of my own," she stammered. "There's nothing for me to do. I have nothing, and no one." "Well," said Ben Weatherstaff slowly as he watched her, "that's true. Thou hasn't." He said it in such an odd way that Mary wondered if he was actually a little sorry for her. She had never felt sorry for herself. She had only felt tired and cross because she disliked people and things so much. But now the world seemed to be changing and getting nicer. If no one found out about the garden, then she should enjoy herself always. She stayed with him for 10 or 15 minutes longer and asked him as many questions as she dared. He answered every one of them in his queer, grunting way, and he did not seem really cross and did not pick up his spade and leave her. He said something about roses just as she was going away, and it reminded her of the ones he said he had been fond of. "Do you go and see those other roses now?" she asked. "Not been this year. My rheumatics has made me too stiff in the joints." He said it in his grumbling voice, but then suddenly he seemed to get a little angry with her, though she did not see why he should. "Now look here," he said sharply, "don't you thart asking so many questions. Thart the worst wench for asking questions I've ever come across. Get thee gone and play thee. I've done talking for today." And he said it so crossly that she knew there was not the least use in staying another minute. She went skipping slowly down the outside walk, thinking him over and over and saying to herself that, queer as he was, here was another person whom she liked, in spite of his crossness. She liked old Ben Weatherstaff. Yes, she did. She always wanted to try to make him talk to her. Also, she began to believe that he knew everything in the world about flowers. I'll see if I can turn another side of that fire together and get some more blazing. Ooh, that's a hot side right there. Oh my goodness. It's exactly what we needed on this cold, wintry feeling night. It's a nice blazing fire.
Yes.
It's very good.
Tend to mean fire.
Thank you. I like burning stuff. Let's see. Where was I? She began to believe that Ben knew everything about flowers. There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved round the secret garden and ended at a gate which opened into a wood in the park. She thought she would slip round this walk and look into the wood and see if there were any rabbits hopping about. She enjoyed the skipping very much. When she reached the little gate, she opened it and went through because she heard a low, peculiar whistling sound and wanted to find out what it was. It was a very strange thing indeed. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such round and blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and from behind a bush nearby a cock pheasant was delicately stretching his neck to peep out, and quite near him were two rabbits sitting and sniffing with tremulous noses, and actually it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange, low little call his pipe seemed to make. When he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a voice almost as low and rather like his piping. "Don't thou move," he said. "It flight 'em." Mary remained motionless. He stopped playing his pipe and began to rise from the ground. He moved so slowly that it scarcely seemed as though he were moving at all. But at last he stood on his feet, and then the squirrel scampered back up into the branches of his tree, the pheasant withdrew his head, and the rabbits hopped on all fours and began to hop away, though not as if they were frightened. "I'm Dickon," the boy said. "I know thou'rt Miss Mary." Then Mary realized that somehow she had known at first that he was Dickon. Who else could have been charming rabbits and pheasants as the natives charm snakes in India? He had a wide, red, curving mouth, and his smile spread all over his face. "I got up slow," he explained, "because if thou makes a quick move, it startles them. A body's asked to move gentle and speak low when wild things is about." He did not speak to her as if they had never seen each other before, but as if he knew her quite well. Mary knew nothing about boys, and she spoke to him a little stiffly because she felt rather shy. "Did you get Martha's letter?" she asked. He nodded his curly, rust-colored head. "That's why I come." He stooped to pick up something which had been lying on the ground beside him when he piped. "I've got the garden tools. There's a little spade and rake, and a fork and a hoe. Hey, they are good uns. There's a trowel, too. And the woman in the shop threw in a packet of white poppy and one of blue seed larkspur when I bought the other ones." "Will you show the seeds to me?" Mary said. She wished she could talk as he did. His speech was so easy. It sounded as if he liked her and was not the least afraid she would not like him, though he was only a common moor boy in patched clothes and with a funny face and a rough, rusty red head. As she came closer to him, she noticed that there was a clean, fresh scent of heather and grass and leaves about him, almost as if he were made of them. She liked it very much, and when she looked into his funny face with the red cheeks and round blue eyes, she forgot that she had felt shy. "Let us sit down on this log and look at them," he said. They sat down, and he took a clumsy little brown paper package out of his coat pocket. He untied the string, and inside there were ever so many neater and smaller packages, with a picture of a flower on each one. "There's a lot of mignonette and poppies," he said. "Mignonette's the sweetest smelling thing as grows, and it'll grow wherever you cast it, same as poppies will. Them as'll come up and bloom if you just whistle to 'em. Them's the nicest of all." He stopped and turned his head quickly, his poppy-cheeked face lighting up. "Where's that robin as is calling us?" he said. The chirp came from a thick holly bush, bright with scarlet berries, and Mary thought she knew whose it was. "Is it really calling us?" she asked. "Aye," said Dickon, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "He's calling someone he's friends with. That's the same as saying, 'Here I am, look at me, I wants a bit of a chat.' There he is in that bush. Whose is he?" "He's been Weatherstaff's, but I think he knows me a little," answered Mary. "Aye, he knows thee," said Dickon in his low voice again, "and he likes thee. He's took thee on. He'll tell me all about thee in a minute." He moved quite close to the bush with the slow movement Mary had noticed before, and then he made a sound almost like the robin's own twitter. The robin listened a few seconds intently, and then answered quite as if he were replying to a question. "Aye, he's a friend of yours," chuckled Dickon. "Do you think he is?" cried Mary eagerly. She did so want to know. "Do you think he really likes me?" "He wouldn't come near thee if he didn't," answered Dickon. "Birds is rare choosers, and a robin can flout a body worse than a man. See, he's making up to thee now. Canna thou see a chap, he's saying?" And it really seemed as if it must be true. He so sidled and twittered and tilted as he hopped on his bush. "Do you understand everything birds say?" said Mary. Dickon's grin spread until he seemed all wide, red, curving mouth, and he rubbed his rough head. I think they do, and they think I do. I've lived on the moor with 'em so long, I've watched 'em break shell and come out of fledge and learn to fly and begin to sing, till I think I'm one of 'em. Sometimes I think perhaps I'm a bird or a rock, fox or a rabbit or a squirrel or even a beetle, and I don't know it. He laughed and came back to the log and began to talk about the flower seeds. He told her what they looked like when they were flowers. He told her how to plant them and watch them and feed and water them. See here, he said suddenly, turning round to look at her. I'll plant them for thee myself. Where is the garden? Mary's thin hands clutched each other as they lay on her lap. She did not know what to say, so for a whole minute she said nothing. She had never thought of this. She felt miserable, and she felt as if she went red and then pale. Thou's got a bit of garden, hasn't thou? Dickon said. It was true that she had turned red and then pale. Dickon saw her do it, and as she still said nothing, he began to be puzzled. Why wouldn't they give thee a bit? He asked. Hasn't thou got any yet? She held her hands tighter and turned her eyes toward him. I don't know anything about boys, she said slowly. Could you keep a secret if I told you one? It's a great secret. I don't know what I should do if anyone found it out. I believe I should die. She said that last sentence quite fiercely. Dickon looked more puzzled than ever and even rubbed his hand over his rough head again, but he answered quite good-humoredly. I'm keeping secrets all the time. If I couldn't keep secrets from the other lads, secrets about foxes' cubs and birds' nests and wild things' holes, there'd be naught safe on the moor. I can keep secrets. Mistress Mary did not mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. I've stolen a garden, she said very fast. It isn't mine. It isn't anybody's. Nobody wants it. Nobody cares for it. Nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything is dead in it already. I don't know. She began to feel as hot and contrary as she had ever felt in her life. I don't care. I don't care. Nobody has any right to take it from me when I care about it, and they don't. They're letting it die all shut in by itself. She ended passionately, and she threw her arms over her face and burst out crying. Poor little Mistress Mary. Dickon's curious blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. Hey, he said, drawing his exclamation out, and the way he did it both meant wonder and sympathy. I've nothing to do, said Mary. Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself, and I got into it myself. I was only just like the robin, and they wouldn't take it from the robin. Where is it? Asked Dickon in a dropped voice. Mistress Mary got up from the log at once. She knew she felt contrary again and obstinate, and she did not care at all. She was imperious and Indian and at the same time hot and sorrowful. Come with me and I'll show you. She led him round the laurel path and to the thick walk where the ivy grew. Dickon followed her with a queer, almost pitying look on his face. He felt as if he were being led to look at some strange bird's nest and must move softly. When she stepped to the wall and lifted the hanging ivy, he started. There was a door, and Mary pushed it slowly open and they passed in together, and then Mary stood and waved her hand round defiantly. It's this, she said. It's a secret garden, and I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive. Dickon looked round and round about it, and round around again. He almost whispered. It is a quiet, queer, pretty place. It's like as if a body was in a dream. That fire is blazing very good.
Fire's nice.
Mm-hmm. That's okay, you can talk. As long as you don't mind people hearing you. Excuse me. Chapter 11. The Nest of the Mistle Thrush. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood looking round him, while Mary watched him, and then he began to walk about softly, even more lightly than Mary had walked the first time she had found herself inside the 4 walls. His eyes seemed to be taking in everything, The gray trees with the gray creepers climbing over them and hanging from their branches, the tangle on the walls and among the grass, the evergreen alcoves with the stone seats and tall flower urns standing in them. I never thought I'd see this place, he said at last. Do you know about it? Asked Mary. She had spoken aloud, and he made a sign to her. We must talk low, he said, or someone will hear us and wonder what's to do in here. Oh, I forgot, said Mary, feeling frightened and putting her hand quickly against her mouth. Did you know about the garden? She asked again when she had recovered herself. Dickon nodded. Martha told me there was one as no one ever went inside, he answered. Us used to wonder what it was like. He stopped and looked round at the lovely gray tangle about him, and his round eyes looked queerly happy. The nest'll be as here come springtime. It'd be the safest nestin' place in England. No one never comin' near and tangles of trees and roses to build in. I wonder all the birds on the moor don't build here. Mistress Mary put her hand on his arm again without knowing it. Will there be roses? She whispered. Can you tell? I thought perhaps they were all dead. No, not them. Not all of them, he answered. Look here. He stepped over to the nearest tree, an old one with gray lichen all over its bark, but upholding a curtain of tangled sprays and branches. He took a thick knife out of his pocket and opened one of its blades. There's lots of dead wood as ought to be cut out, he said, and there's a lot of old wood, but it made some new last year. This here's the new bit, and he touched a shoot, which looked brownish green instead of a hard, dry gray. Mary touched it herself in an eager, reverent way. That one? She said. Is that one quite alive? Dickon curved his wide, smiling mouth. It's as wick as you or me, he said, and Mary remembered that Martha had told her that wick meant alive or lively. I'm glad it's wick, she cried out in her whisper. I want them all to be wick. Let us go round the garden and count how many wick ones there are. She quite panted with eagerness, and Dickon was as eager as she was. They went from tree to tree and from bush to bush. Dickon carried his knife in his hand and showed her things which she thought wonderful. They've run wild, he said, but the strongest ones have fair thrived on it. The delicatest ones has died out, but the others has growed and spread till they's a wonder. See here? And he pulled down a thick, gray, dry-looking branch. A body might think this was dead wood, but I don't believe it is, down to the root. I'll cut it low down and see. He knelt and with his knife cut the lifeless-looking branch through, not far above the earth. There, he said exultantly, I told thee so. There's green in that wood yet. Look at it. Mary was down on her knees before he spoke, gazing with all her might. When it looks a bit greenish and juicy like that, it's wick, he explained. When the inside is dry and breaks easy, like this here piece I've cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here, as all this live wood sprung out of it, as if the old wood's cut off and it's dug round and took care of. There'll be... He stopped and lifted his face to look at the climbing and hanging sprays above him. There'll be a fountain of roses here this summer. They went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. He was very strong and clever with his knife and knew how to cut the dry and dead wood away and could tell when an unpromising bough or twig still had life in it. In the course of half an hour, Mary thought she could tell too, and when he cut through a lifeless-looking branch, she would cry out joyfully under her breath when she caught sight of the least shade of moist green. The spade and hoe and fork were very useful. He showed her how to use the fork while he dug about roots with the spade and stirred the earth and let the air in. They were working industriously round one of the biggest standard roses, when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise. Why, he cried, pointing to the grass a few feet away, who did that there? It was one of Mary's own little clearings round the pale green points. I did it, said Mary. Why, I thought thou didn't know nothing about gardening. I don't, she answered, but they were so little and the grass was so thick and strong, they looked as if they had no room to breathe, so I made a little place for them. I don't even know what they are. Dickon went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile. Thou was right, he said. A gardener couldn't have told thee better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is narcissuses. he said, turning to another patch. "And here's Daffy Down Dillies. Eh, they will be a sight." He ran from one clearing to another. "Thou hast done a lot of work for such a little wench," he said, looking her over. "I'm growing fatter," said Mary, "and I'm growing stronger. I used to always be tired. When I dig, I'm not tired at all. I like to smell the earth when it's turned up." "It's rare good for thee," he said, nodding his head wisely. "There's naught as nice as the smell of good clean earth, except the smell of fresh growing things when the rain falls on 'em. I get out on the moor many a day when it's raining, and I lie under a bush and listen to the soft swish of drops on the heather, and I just sniff and sniff. My nose end fair quivers like a rabbit, mother says." "Do you never catch cold?" inquired Mary, gazing at him wonderingly. She had never seen such a funny boy, or such a nice one. "Not me," he said, grinning. "I never catched cold since I was born. I wasn't brought up nesh enough. I've chased about the moor in all weathers, same as the rabbits does. Mother says I've snipped up too much fresh air for 12 year ever to get sniffin' with cold. I'm as tough as white thorn knobstick." He was working all the time he was talking, and Mary was following him and helping with her fork or the trowel. "There's a lot of work to do here," he said once, looking about quite exultantly. "Will you come again and help me to do it?" Mary begged. "I'm sure I can help, too. I can dig and pull up weeds and do whatever you tell me. Oh, do come, Dickon." "I'll come every day if thou wants me, rain or shine," he answered stoutly. "It's the best fun I ever had in my life, shut up in here and wakening up a garden." "If you will come," said Mary, "if you will help me make it alive, I don't know what I'll do," she ended helplessly. "What could you do for a boy like that?" "I'll tell thee what thou'll do," said Dickon with his happy grin. "Thou'll get fat, and thou'll get as hungry as a young fox, and thou'll learn how to talk to a robin, same as I do. We'll have a lot of fun." He began to walk about, looking up in the trees and at the walls and bushes with a thoughtful expression. "I wouldn't want to make it look like a gardener's garden, all clipped and spick and span, would you?" he said. "It's nicer like this, with things running wild and swinging and catching hold of each other." "Don't let us make it tidy," said Mary anxiously. "It wouldn't seem like a secret garden if it was tidy." Dickon stood rubbing his rusty red head with a rather puzzled look. "It's a secret garden, sure enough," he said, "but seems like someone besides the robin must have been in it since it was shut up 10 year ago." "But the door was locked and the key was buried," said Mary. "No one could get in." "That's true," he answered. "It's a queer place. Seems to me as if there'd been a bit of pruning done here and there later than 10 year ago." "But how could it have been done?" said Mary. He was examining a branch of a standard rose, and he shook his head. "Aye, how could it?" he murmured, "with the door locked and the key buried." Mistress Mary always felt that however many years she lived, she should never forget that first morning when her garden began to grow. Of course, it did seem to begin to grow for her that morning. When Dickon began to clear places to plant seeds, she remembered what Basil had sung at her when he wanted to tease her. "Are there any flowers that look like little bells?" she inquired. "Lilies of the valley does," he answered, digging away with the trowel. "And there's Canterbury bells and campanulas." "Let's plant some," said Mary. "There's lilies of the valley here already. I saw 'em. They'll have growed too close, and we'll have to separate 'em, but there's plenty. The other ones take 2 years to bloom, but I can bring you some bits." Then Mary told him all about Basil and his brothers and sisters in India, and how she had hated them, and their calling her Mistress Mary quite contrary. "They used to dance round and sing at me. They sang, 'Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells, marigolds all in a row.' I just remembered it, and it made me wonder if there really were flowers like silver bells." She frowned a little and gave her trowel a rather spiteful dig into the earth. "I wasn't as contrary as they were." But Dickon laughed. He said as he crumbled the rich black soil. She saw he was sniffing up the scent of it. "There doesn't seem to be no need for no one to be contrary when there's flowers and such like, and such lots of wild friendly things running about making homes, or building nests and singing and whistling, does there?" Mary, kneeling by him, holding the seeds, looking at him, stopped frowning. "Dickon, you are as nice as Martha said you were. I like you, and you make the 5th person. I never thought I should like 5 people." Dickon sat up on his heels, as Martha did when she was polishing the grate. He did look funny and delightful, Mary thought, with his round blue eyes and red cheeks and happy-looking turned-up nose. "Only 5 folk as thou likes," he said. "Who is the other 4? "Your mother and Martha," Mary checked them off on her fingers, "and the robin and Ben Weatherstaff." Dickon laughed so that he was obliged to stifle the sound by putting his arm over his mouth. "I know thou thinks I'm a queer lad," he said, "but I think thou'rt the queerest little lass I ever saw." Then Mary did a strange thing. She leaned forward and asked him a question she had never dreamed of asking anyone before, and she tried to ask it in Yorkshire because that was his language, and a native is always pleased if you know their speech. "Does thou like me?" she said. He answered heartily, "that I does. I like thee wonderful, and so does the robin, I do believe." "That's 2 then," said Mary. "That's 2 for me." And then they began to work harder than ever and more joyfully. Mary was startled and sorry when she heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the big hour of her midday dinner. "I shall have to go," she said mournfully, "and you will have to go too, won't you?" Dickon grinned. "My dinner's easy to carry about with me. Mother always lets me put a bit of something in my pocket." He picked up his coat from the grass and brought out a pocket, a lumpy little bundle tied up in a clean, coarse blue and white handkerchief. It held 2 thick pieces of bread with a slice of something laid between them. "It's often as not but bread," he said, "but I've got a fine slice of fat bacon with it today." Mary thought it looked a queer dinner, but he seemed ready to enjoy it. "Run on and get thy victuals," he said. "I'll be done with mine first. I'll get some more work done before I start back home." He sat down with his back against a tree. "I'll call the robin up," he said, "and give 'em the rind of the bacon to peck at. They likes a bit of fat wonderful." Mary could scarcely bear to leave him. Suddenly it seemed as if he might be a sort of wood fairy, who might be gone when she came into the garden again. He seemed too good to be true. She went slowly halfway to the door in the wall, and then she stopped and went back. "Whatever happens, you'll never would tell." His poppy-colored cheeks were distended with his first big bite of bread and bacon, but he managed to smile encouragingly. "If thou was a missel thrush and showed me where thy nest was, does thou think I'd tell anyone? Not me. Thou'rt as safe as a missel thrush." And she was quite sure she was. Chapter 12. Mary ran so fast that she was rather out of breath when she reached her room. Her hair was ruffled on her forehead, and her cheeks were bright pink. Her dinner was waiting on the table, and Martha was sitting near it. "Thou's a bit late," she said. "Where's thou been?" "I've seen Dickon," said Mary. "I've seen Dickon." "I knew he'd come," said Martha exultantly. "How does thou like him?" I think he's beautiful," said Mary in a determined voice. Martha looked rather taken aback, but she looked pleased too. "Well, he's the best lad as ever was born, but us never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much." "I like it to turn up," said Mary. "And his eyes is so round," said Martha, a trifle doubtful, "though they're a nice color." "I like them round," said Mary, "and they're exactly the color of the sky over the moor." Martha beamed with satisfaction. "Mother says he made 'em that color with always looking up at the birds and the clouds, but he has got a big mouth, hasn't he?" "I love his big mouth," said Mary obstinately. "I wish mine were just like it." Martha chuckled delightedly. "It'd look rare and funny in thy bit of a face, but I knowed it would be that way when thou saw him. How did thou like the seeds and the garden tools?" "How did you know he brought them?" asked Mary. I never thought of him not bringing 'em. He'd be sure to bring 'em if they was in Yorkshire. He's such a trusty lad." Mary was afraid that she might begin to ask difficult questions, but she did not. She was very much interested in the seeds and the gardening tools, and there was only one moment when Mary was frightened. This was when she began to ask where the flowers were to be planted. "Who did thou ask about it?" she inquired. "I haven't asked anybody yet," said Mary, hesitating. "Well, I wouldn't ask the head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is." "I've never seen him. I've only seen under gardeners and Ben Weatherstaff." "If I was you, I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff," advised Martha. "He's not half as bad as he looks, for all he's so crabbed. Mr. Craven lets him do what he likes, because he was here when Mrs. Craven was alive, and he used to make her laugh. She liked him. Perhaps he'd find you a corner somewhere out of the way. If it was out of the way and no one wanted it, no one could mind my having it, could they? Mary said anxiously. There wouldn't be no reason, answered Martha. You wouldn't do no harm. Mary ate her dinner as quickly as she could, and when she rose from the table, she was going to run to her room to put on her hat again, but Martha stopped her. I've got something to tell you, she said. I thought I'd let you eat your dinner first. Mr. Craven came back this morning, and I think he wants to see you. Mary turned quite pale. Oh, why? Why? He didn't want to see me when I came in. I heard Pitcher say he didn't. Well, explained Martha, Mrs. Medlock says it's because of Mother. She was walking to Thwaite Village and she met him. She never spoke to him before, but Mrs. Craven had been to our cottage 2 or 3 times. He'd forgot, but Mother hadn't, and she made bold to stop him. I don't know what she said to him about you, but she said something as put him in the mind to see you before he goes away again tomorrow. Oh, cried Mary, is he going away tomorrow? I'm glad. He's going for a long time. He mayn't come back till autumn or winter. He's going to travel in foreign places. He's always doing it. Oh, I'm so glad, Mary said thankfully. If he did not come back until winter or even autumn, there would be a time to watch the secret garden come alive. Even if he found out then and took it away from her, she would have had that much at least. When do you think he'll want to see? She did not finish the sentence because the door opened and Mrs. Medlock walked in. She had on her best black dress and cap, and her collar was fastened with a large brooch with a picture of a man's face on it. It was a colored photograph of Mr. Medlock, who had died years ago, and she always wore it when she was dressed up. She looked nervous and excited. Your hair's rough, she said quickly. Go and brush it. Martha, help her to slip on her best dress. Mr. Craven sent me to bring her to him in his study. All of the pink left Mary's cheeks. Her heart began to thump, and she felt herself changing into a stiff, plain, silent child again. She did not even answer Mrs. Medlock, but turned and walked into her bedroom, followed by Martha. She said nothing while her dress was changed and her hair brushed, and after she was quite tidy, she followed Mrs. Medlock down the corridors in silence. What was there for her to say? She was obliged to go and see Mr. Craven, and he would not like her, and she would not like him. She knew what he would think of her. She was taken to a part of the house she had never been into before. At last, Mrs. Medlock knocked at a door, and when someone said, "Come in," they entered the room together. A man was sitting in an armchair before the fire, and Mrs. Medlock spoke to him. This is Miss Mary, sir, she said. You can go and leave her here. I will ring for you when I want you to take her away, said Mr. Craven. When she went out and closed the door, Mary could only stand waiting, a plain little thing, twisting her thin hands together. She could see that the man in the chair was not so much a hunchback as a man with high, rather crooked shoulders, and he had a black hair streaked with white. He turned his head over his high shoulders and spoke to her. Come here, he said. Mary went to him. He was not ugly. His face would have been handsome if it had not been so miserable. He looked as if the sight of her worried and fretted him, and as if he did not know what in the world to do with her. Are you well? He asked. Yes, answered Mary. Do they take good care of you? Yes. He rubbed his forehead fretfully as he looked her over. You are very thin, he said. I am getting fatter, Mary answered in what she knew was her stiffest way. What an unhappy face he had. His black eyes seemed as if they scarcely saw her, as if they were seeing something else, and he could hardly keep his thoughts upon her. I forgot you, he said. How could I remember you? I intended to send you a governess or a nurse or someone of that sort, but I forgot. Please, began Mary, please, and then the lump in her throat choked her. What do you want to say? He inquired. I am too big for a nurse, and please don't make me get a governess yet. He rubbed his forehead again and stared at her. That was what the Sowerby woman said. Then Mary gathered a scrap of her courage. Is she Martha's mother? Yes, I think so, he replied. She knows about children. She has 12. She knows. He seemed to rouse himself. What do you want to do? I want to play out of doors, Mary answered, hoping that her voice did not tremble. I never liked it in India. It makes me hungry here, and I'm getting fatter. He was watching her. Mrs. Sowerby said it would do you good. Perhaps it will. She thought you had better get stronger before you had a governess. It makes me feel strong when I play and the wind comes over the moor. Where do you play? Everywhere. Martha's mother sent me a skipping rope. I skip and run, and I look about to see if things are beginning to stick up out of the earth. I don't do any harm. Don't look so frightened, he said in a worried voice. You could not do any harm, a child like you. You may do what you like. Mary put her hand up to her throat because she was afraid he might see the excited lump which she felt jump into it. She came a step nearer to him. May I? She said tremulously. Her anxious little face seemed to worry him more than ever. Don't look so frightened. Of course you may. I am your guardian, though I am a poor one for any child. I cannot give you time or attention. I'm too ill and wretched and distracted. But I wish you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Mrs. Medlock is to see that you have all you need. I sent for you today because Mrs. Sowerby said I ought to see you. Hi, puppy. I'm glad to see you. I got my good mic out for the fireplace storytelling. Her daughter had talked about you. She thought you needed fresh air and freedom and running about. She knows all about children, Mary said again in spite of herself. She ought to, said Mr. Craven. I thought her rather bold to stop me on the moor, but she said Mrs. Craven had been kind to her. It seemed hard for him to speak his dead wife's name. She is a respectable woman. Now I have seen you, I think she said sensible things. Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place, and you may go where you like and amuse yourself as you like. Is there anything you want? As if a sudden thought had struck him. Do you want toys, books, dolls? Might I, quavered Mary, might I have a bit of earth? In her eagerness, she did not know how queer the words would sound, and that they were not the ones she had meant to say. Mr. Craven looked quite startled. Earth? He repeated. What do you mean? To plant seeds in, to make things grow, to see them come alive, Mary faltered. He gazed at her a moment and then passed his hand quickly over his eyes. Do you care about gardens so much? He said slowly. I didn't know about them in India, said Mary. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. Sometimes I made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them. But here it's different. Mr. Craven got up and began to walk slowly across the room. A bit of earth, he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his dark eyes looked almost soft and kind. You can have as much earth as you want, he said. You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want, with something like a smile, take it, child, and make it come alive. May I take it from anywhere, if it's not wanted? Anywhere, he answered. There. You must go now. I am tired. He touched the bell to call Mrs. Medlock. Goodbye. I shall be away all summer. Mrs. Medlock came so quickly that Mary thought she must have been waiting in the corridor. Mrs. Medlock, Mr. Craven said to her, now I have seen the child, I understand what Mrs. Sowerby meant. She must be less delicate before she begins lessons. Give her simple, healthy food. Let her run wild in the garden. Don't look after her too much. She needs liberty and fresh air and romping about. Mrs. Sowerby is to come and see her now and then, and she may sometimes go to the cottage. Mrs. Medlock looked pleased. She was relieved to hear that she need not look after Mary too much. She had felt her a tiresome charge, and as indeed seen as little of her as she dared. In addition to this, she was fond of Martha's mother. Thank you, sir, she said. Susan Sowerby and me went to school together, and she's as sensible and good-hearted a woman as you'd find in a day's walk. I never had any children myself, and she's had 12, and there never was healthier or better ones. Miss Mary can get no harm from them. I'd almost always take Susan Sowerby's advice about children myself. She's what you might call healthy-minded, if you understand me. I understand, Mr. Craven answered. Take Miss Mary away now and send Pitcher to me. When Mrs. Medlock left her at the end of her own corridor, Mary flew back to her room. She found Martha waiting there. Martha had, in fact, hurried back after she had removed dinner service. I can have my garden, cried Mary. I may have it wherever I like. I'm not going to have a governess for a long time. Your mother is coming to see me, and I may go to your cottage. He says a little girl like me could not do any harm, and I may do what I like, anywhere. Oh, said Martha delightedly, that was nice of him, wasn't it? Martha, said Mary solemnly, he really is a nice man, only his face is so miserable, and his forehead is all drawn together. She ran as quickly as she could to the garden. She had been away so much longer than she had thought she should be, and she knew Dickon would have set out early on his 5-mile walk. When she slipped through the door under the ivy, saw he was not working where she had left him. The gardening tools were laid together under a tree. She ran to them, looking all round the place, but there was no Dickon to be seen. He had gone away, and the secret garden was empty, except for the robin, who had just flown across the wall and sat on a standard rosebush watching her. He's gone, she said woefully. Oh, was he? Was he only a wood fairy? Something white fastened to the standard rosebush caught her eye. It was a piece of paper, in fact, a piece of the letter she had printed for Martha to send to Dickon. It was fastened on the bush with a long thorn, and in a minute she knew Dickon had left it there. There were some roughly printed letters on it, and a sort of picture. At first she could not tell what it was. Then she saw it was meant for a nest, with a bird sitting on it. Underneath were the printed letters, and they said, I will come back.